Hello everybody, and welcome to a session here that a lot of people have kind of asked me for, and I found it difficult to try and explain to people either in text or through emails or whatnot. So I'm going to try my best to try and explain how to do small lettering and how to edit the lettering so that it fits your specific needs. Now this is only going to pertain to Design Shop 9 or Design Shop in general, but I use Design Shop 9 Pro. If you don't have the Pro version, you're probably not going to be able to do any of this because the Pro version is the only version that allows you to physically digitize and to make alterations other than resizing. That being said, let's get a couple of quick things out of the way. What are the fonts? Design Shop works with not only the fonts that are on your system, but it also has its own fonts that are supplied to it by Milko. On the screen you can see three different samples of text, the top, the middle, and the bottom. And the top text here is a PostScript font, and you can tell because it's got like this little EA symbol in front of it. And in fact there are quite a number of those types of fonts. The middle font is a TrueType font. Both the first one and the second one are fonts that are usable by your system Windows. Windows can use both of these types of fonts for things like Word documents, text documents, and so on and so forth. The third font is, it's kind of proprietary to Design Shop. I'm not really overly familiar with the file extension to it. I don't know if it's a remnant of an old Kodak format. Um, but this is a font that comes with Design Shop, and in fact it actually has its own directory. Bear with me because what you are about to see is not how you will get around in Windows. I use a proprietary filing system or file viewing system called Directory Opus. Under this directory, your program files x86 if you're in Windows 10 or 7. Anything below that, it'll be program files. But in your program files, your Melco Design Shop, Diversion, you'll find an alphabets directory. These are the fonts that come with your system or with your Design Shop, and they are proprietary to your package or your Design Shop. They are not usable by Windows. In contrast, the Windows files or the font files are in a separate directory, usually in the Windows fonts directory, but the newer operating systems from Windows have them in the root directory of C. These have to be installed, and these are usable by the system. So we have three different types of fonts. Now, for the most part, they work fine. But when you start getting into very small fonts, and I mean small, some of the fonts that I do are typically not more than, maybe a few millimeters tall, like 3-4 millimeters tall. That can run into some serious problems, especially when you start looking at some of the other letters, such as when you start running into things like the E's, the I's, the T's, the F's, the P's, or even like the number 1. You'll see that you have, the smaller the font goes, the more likely you are to see an issue with like the tails of the E, looking like they're too close and closing and almost looking like a letter O with a line through it. Similarly, the letter I, the dot can look rather differently as it gets smaller. It'll be much harder to disseminate the dot from the rest of the letter I. You may find that the cross section in the letter T's or the F's are no longer long enough to make it visible or visually appealing. They're too short and they look too close to the actual stem and they don't look correct. The letter P, for instance, or the letter Q, the underhanging tail may not be long enough. So it may look funny or it just may look out of place. I'm going to show you how to fix some of these issues and possibly even how to actually get it to the point where you won't have to fix it each and every time. When you're doing small lettering, uh, bear in mind that usually fonts such as the ones like this one right here, where they're very thin, they're very narrow, they tend to work the best. You don't want things such as this because the smaller you get them, the more trouble you run into the spacing, and they just don't look correct. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use them, and I will go over a few caveats and maybe how to get some of these fonts to work for you. But it's usually best to work with fonts such as the ones there and also the ones here. They're very simple, they're clean, they're very easily done. They can be done very easily with a very short, narrow satin stitch, and they work the best. So what happens when we get into the situation where the letters get tiny and we need to make a change? Well, what we need to do is, if you select your text, you'll notice that each and every letter or character has an X in it. This is so that we can actually select each character individually within the text. This is complete lettering. I have typed it. It is not an individual letter placed. It has been physically typed. So what we would need to do in the event we wanted to make these letters smaller is, for instance, the letter E. Okay? Select the X. Now you'll notice that only the E is selected. Once the E is selected, we can go to full wireframe editing, which is up here. We can go to wireframe editing mode, and you'll notice that now we see the individual points on each one of these letters. When you're working with a true type font or a font that comes with Design Shop, you're limited to what you can alter. If you're working with a PostScript font, however, we have a little bit more flexibility. In this particular instance, I am working with a PostScript font, which means that I can actually come in and I could actually edit and add extra points if I wanted to. I could add extra cross sections. Now what this allows me to do is, if I wanted to, I could select that right there, the one point, and I could delete it. And you'll notice that now it opens it up more. And you've noticed that I added this point in there to prevent it from dropping all the way down here and maybe taking out too much of the letter at once. But if I wanted to, I could come along and delete that and make it bigger and make it more open so that when it stitches in a smaller font, it doesn't look so closed and so claustrophobic. The same thing can be done with the letter I. You can select the letter I, go into wireframe editing mode. Now what you can do is you can hold on your shift key and select the 2 points, hold down your alternate key, select one of the points and drag, and you'll notice that it locks the position to whatever direction you are going in. So in other words, I can't move it left or right, but I could move it up or down. Had I made my first initial movement to the left or to the right, it would not have let me move it up or down, only left or right. So if I held down my alternate key again and moved it this way, it will move left and right. And if I do that again, oops, and that's what happens when you make a mistake. Select your wireframe editing mode, select your points, and my first initial movement is left or right. So what you'll see is I can move it left or right, and it keeps the orientation where I wanted it. But the other thing that you somewhat kind of need to do is, in some cases, because you're making the letter I, is you actually you need to make this bigger, because that's going to get smaller too, and it's going to require more of an area in order for it to look better. So you'll have to make the dot bigger, but you'll need to make the stem smaller. And you can make it as tall or as short as you want. And for some reason my alternate key is not working. But you can make it as tall as or as short as you want, depending on how big or small you need the letters to be. And you really won't know this until you do your final stitch out and you kind of get a feel for what's looking closed, what's looking too tight, and that will give you a better idea of what you need to do in order to make it look better. The same things can be also done with like the letter T's. You can go back into wireframe editing mode, and you can come along and you can move individual points if you so desire, but you can make them longer, and you can make them more pronounced, more defined, more, a little bit more pleasing to the eye as they get smaller. And the same can be done for your letters, the letters that you have physically typed out. The other thing to bear in mind is, for instance, the letter I. Let's go back and select the letter I, and I apologize if I'm going too fast for you. I'm kind of doing this off the cuff. I'm not really have anything written down or in mind. I just needed to get this out while I had some free time. Once you've selected the letter, you'll see a green circle and a red X. These are your start and your stop points. In other words, this is where the needle first makes its entry, and this is where the needle finishes up and makes its last stitch on this letter. But you'll notice that with this letter I, we have a line coming down the center, and we have one coming down here as well. Just by changing your end and your stop points, you'll notice that we got rid of one of those, which makes this a much cleaner looking font. Had you left that in there and left it down here, when you stitched this out, what would have happened was, because you're getting so small, you would have ended up with like a double line, and it just wouldn't have looked correct. It would have interfered with the way it looked. You want as little obstructions to your characters as physically possible. So you can move it here, you can move it here, but you'll see that you're only left with this one little line right there, which you may or may not choose to snip out at the end of the stitching process. It is entirely up to you, and depending on how it looks, a lot of times I just leave it. The other two fonts, as I said, which are not PostScript fonts, they can be edited similarly. The biggest difference is that once you go into wireframe editing mode, you cannot add any additional points. You cannot delete any additional points. You are only able to change the points that are currently in that letter. For instance, I could not delete that. I could not add anything in between these like I did the last time. What you would need to do in a case like this is physically move the points out of your way and try to make it look the best that you can. That's one of the drawbacks of using a true type font or the Melco fonts is that you cannot add or delete existing points. You can only change existing points. Sometimes it becomes a little bit of a hassle in order to do that, in order to get it to look good. Other times it's not so difficult, as you just saw right there. But that's all well, fine, and dandy, you say. Okay, but I don't want to have to do that every single time for every single letter that I type. Well, you may not have to. If it's a font that you use regularly for a customer, like I do, what you can do is, once you have made your edit that you like, and you know that it looks good, you've done your test sew out, and it looks acceptable, and you want to use that font over again, select the text, select one of the letters that you have changed, and you can go to, once you've selected the letter, you can right click on it and say save the letter. Once you've done this, you'll see where it says it needs to convert the alphabet. It's going to convert this alphabet into a form that is saved in the default Design Shop format. So, in other words, we have the Design Shop alphabets here, and you'll see that I don't have this font here, but I'm going to save it. I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to give it, we'll kind of call it 1-1 test font. Okay. You'll now see that I have an 11 test font.ofa. This has now been converted into a font that can be used by Design Shop and only Design Shop. It is a native Design Shop font at this particular point in time. You'll also notice that you don't see it anywhere in this list as of just yet. Well, if we were to close this out, in theory, if everything works well, when I call this back up, I should be able to select it. It has to regenerate the previews because you've added a new font. Now it should show up right there. And you'll notice that the E changed. If you make a change to a letter, make all the changes that you want to that, or come back later and make another change. Now, I could come back here and I could make another change. I could go back into wireframe editing mode. I could select those. I could make those smaller. Oops. And I could save. I can do the same thing. I could say save the letter. Now you'll see that no matter how many times that I type the letter I, they're all going to be identical. No matter how many times I type the letter E, they will always be identical. You will always be able to have the exact same letter again and again and again. It will save your letters, it will save the shapes, it will save your entry and your exit points on each letter. So now you could call this font whatever you wanted. You could give it the customer's name, customer X font. And the next time that the customer wants a name embroidered or you need to use that font, you just call up that font and just type your text and there you go. You don't have to edit the font each and every time. Once you get the font exactly the way you like it, you can save it and you have a physical copy of that font already altered and you never have to alter it again. You just have to type the letters the way you want. And you can change these at any time you want. All you have to do is make a change, right click on the letter and say save letter and it will save it and you'll have that font. You'll notice that now that it's been saved, I don't have to convert the alphabet. It's already been converted. So anytime that I make a change, it's automatically updated in that font. So I no longer have to have multiple copies. I just need to make the copy once, make my changes, save the letter, and you're all fine and well and dandy, and you have a font that you'll never have to edit again unless you run into a different situation and you need to make different changes to those letters. And there you go. But that's only part of the issue. So now what you're going to be left with is you have the font, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to come out clean. Again, this is all going to depend on exactly what uh, what size letters that you need and or want. And the one way to get around this is one of three different ways. 9 times out of 10 when you're embroidering something, you're going to be using a thread. I use Madeira threads exclusively, poly neons, and 7511 needles. This is a 40 weight thread with a 7511 needle. But if you want something a little bit smaller, well, maybe you might want to go to a 60 weight thread, and you'll notice that the color of the spool on Madeira, it indicates the overall thickness of the thread. A blue top is a 60 weight thread in most cases. Excuse me. And with this, I would recommend using a 65-9 needle. It's a slightly smaller needle. If you need something even smaller, and I have actually done lettering that is legible in the space of a quarter, only Madeira makes this type of thread. I call this angel hair. This is a 75 weight thread. It is ultra thin. It is literally angel hair. I recommend using a 68 needle. You don't have to use a 60/8. You could use a 65/9. You could use a 7511. For best results, you're probably going to want to use a 60/8. Unless, of course, that you're sewing through something very heavy, very thick, such as leather. If you wanted to use one of these needles, you're probably going to want to slow your machine down and be prepared to have needle breaks. They are very small needles, but they work beautifully. Between these two little tips and tricks here, between the threads and how to edit your actual files, your fonts, you should be able to get fonts that look very clean. The other thing that you may notice is that the smaller your font gets, your density might need to be changed. Um, a 4 density might look better small than than say a 3.5 density or a 3 density on real, like you might have for bigger letters. Sometimes reducing the overall density can make a big difference as well. And also try to remember that in some of these smaller letters, it's probably best to use tie-ins and tie-offs so that they have less of a chance of unraveling, because once being small, once they start to unravel, they can look pretty crappy really quick. It doesn't take much of an unraveling situation to make a letter look clean to a letter that looks like literal crap. Usually I will use a style 3. Um, a style 3 is this style right here. That's my preferred choice. At this point, all I can tell you is you're going to have to use the techniques that I've given you. Do your sew outs. Check your start and your end um, points and make sure that they look okay. Um, you might find that it looks better to have continuous letters, one right after the other. It might look better if you were to snip in between each letter. And God, I know that it can make the difference between doing something in 5 minutes and doing something that takes 15 minutes. But sometimes it's worth the effort to snip each letter individually, especially in small letters. It's tough to get in with little snips. It's tough to get those little threads out of the way. That's going to be up to you. That's going to be up to your customer, and that's just going to have to be something that you're going to have to make the decision on for yourself. I hope this helps out a little bit. Um, Again, I apologize if this was rushed, but I have limited time and I wanted to get this done as quickly as I could. I've been promising people to get this done. Feel free to leave comments below in the video if you want to see anything else, or if you want me to try and explain something in a little bit more detail later. But hopefully with what I've just given you, it will give you the confidence and a better understanding of how you can better make small text to get the results that you're looking for. I wish you all luck, and I hope that you all enjoyed this video. And again, leave me a comment if you'd like. I'm always open to listening to what y'all have to say. So have a great day, guys. Have fun.